Russian and Ukrainian officials are in Abu Dhabi for three-way talks brokered by the United States. It is the second time both sides are meeting this year, after last month's negotiations ended without a breakthrough. This round of talks, initially scheduled for last weekend, will span 2 days. Delegations are expected to cover key issues mainly around territorial disputes and Ukraine's security guarantees. US President Donald Trump appeared optimistic that both sides seem open to striking a deal, adding that an end to the 4-year war is within reach. Russia is doubling down its military campaign on Ukraine in what Kyiv described as its most powerful attack this year. Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, has accused Moscow of breaking its promise with Mr. Trump to hold off from attacking Ukraine's power grid. But the Kremlin said the truce has expired beforehand. Let's get more. We have Dasha Cherny-shova in Moscow, Kate Fisher in Washington, D.C., both reporting live for CNN. Dasha, to you first. What does Russia seek to get out of these negotiations or achieve? What does it want?
Well, as we hear, the Kremlin insists that its position is well known both to Kyiv and to Washington. So Russia is trying to avoid any publicity to the substance of those talks. But we know the composition of the Russian delegation is military one, and there are MOD officials who are in Abu Dhabi for those talks. So in this round of the negotiations, Russia's position is quite understandable from the terms of the technical issues that are related to the troop withdrawal. Russia has been demanding the Ukrainian side to withdraw all of its troops from the territory of the entire Donbas region. And Moscow has been saying that Ukraine should not be trying to sabotage those negotiations because Ukraine does not hold the upper hand on the battlefield. So in this round of talks, it does seem that Moscow will be trying to make sure that any deal is in line with Russia's red lines, and the deal that the sides are talking about corresponds with Russia's concerns, so that Ukraine in the future, as Moscow always insists, does not turn again into the so-called anti-Russia. But these rounds of talks, according to several political analysts here in Russia, does seem to be very different from the previous negotiations for one very important reason. There are political decisions that have already been made. Now the sides are talking about the technical issues.
Interesting. Now, what Ukraine wants is to solidify more Western security guarantees in return for dropping its NATO ambitions. Now, should this come into force, what would that mean for Moscow?
Well, it all depends on what sort of guarantees Ukraine would be getting in terms of security, because on this issue, there have been many statements coming from Russia suggesting that there have been terms on which Ukraine could have been provided with security guarantees. Those terms were agreed upon back in April 2022, when the sides just started fighting and started negotiating in Istanbul. And back then, security guarantees were provided to both sides, Moscow and Kyiv, and Russia insists those were the guarantees that were agreed upon by both sides. Now, Russia insists that any presence of the foreign troops on the Ukrainian territory, be it during the conflict or post-conflict, would be regarded as foreign intervention by Moscow. That is an acceptable threat to Russia's security. So it does seem to be a non-starter for the Russian side. So the devil is in the detail. Russia insists that Ukrainian security guarantees should be part of the common security guarantees and the wider security in Eurasia.
Dasha, thank you. And from Russia, let's go to Washington. Kate Fisher standing by. Kate, as territorial concerns continue, as we hear, to be that sticking point, how does the U.S. plan, does it have a fresh strategy to bring both sides together to actually reach the finishing line of this peace deal?
Well, it seems to be, has been proved impossible so far, but there is some hope, I think, some signs of optimism that perhaps things could be slightly different this time round. Analysts here saying that the change in personnel at these talks, for example, there is a new negotiating team for the Ukrainians who appear to have a better chance, according to these analysts, at that talking to the Russians, they seem to have more respect from the Russian side. Also, you have Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner for the US, both of whom have managed some international diplomacy over the first year of Donald Trump's, some successes in their international diplomacy over the first year of Donald Trump's second presidency. And there are certainly some signs of optimism about perhaps there could be some sort of breakthrough in these talks. But all that is caveated, of course, with the fact that nothing has broken through so far, and it's kind of the Vladimir Putin playbook to keep attending negotiations and summits, but to actually continue the war despite whatever is being said at these summits. There hasn't been any change on the battlefield, except you did note the ceasefire over the last week, which ended on Sunday, and immediately the Russians restarted with an incredibly powerful strike.
Yeah, also interesting to note that the meeting is taking place right before the expiry of the nuclear treaty between the US and Russia. Are we anticipating any sort of knock-on effect from that?
Well, the fact is that that treaty seems to have expires at the end of the 4th of February, and really there hasn't been major discussions between Russia and the US about reigniting it and trying to extend it. But certainly it adds an extra dimension to these talks that by the end of the 4th of February, there is no longer this guardrail over their nuclear arsenals, and essentially that does make things feel less stable than they even were before. So it's certainly not an ideal situation to have. Vladimir Putin did suggest renewing it back in September, and at the time Donald Trump said that sounded like a good idea. But since then, nothing has happened between the two countries to extend the treaty. And therefore, by the end of the 4th of February, there will no longer be those nuclear guardrails between the two biggest nuclear powers in the world. One of the reasons perhaps the US is not keen to do that is because they're concerned about China's military buildup in the nuclear sphere, and they want to make sure that the US has enough weapons to combat not just Russia, but also a potential threat from China.
All right, thanks for that. Kate Fisher in Washington, D.C., reporting live for CNA.